I recently received this comment from a loyal viewer. Hey man, I'm about 5 minutes and 30 seconds into your video and I already have that proof you asked for. You pulled a random clip from a Joel video that isn't an argument and used that to say that it was his only argument and therefore he didn't make one. I checked that Joel video and he goes on to discuss why he believes that later on, which is his typical style. I don't think it is necessary to check a video on something I agree with you on, because seemingly the only thing you do is make videos on trans people. I know you won't change your mind from a comment though, so who cares? Okay, so this comment might leave you asking a lot of questions. What video was it posted on? What proof did I ask for? And what belief of Big Joel's was supposedly misrepresented? Well, for context, it would be good to actually show you the clip for which this guy dropped the timestamp. By the way, sometimes when I talk about issues other than trans identity, I'll get comments from people saying, "Ugh, you should just stick to the trans issue. You clearly know nothing about this topic and you're just making yourself look like an idiot." And okay, fine, I don't really care if you only enjoy my videos when I'm talking about the issues where you already agreed with me. That's your prerogative. But you have to understand that I'm the kind of guy who has made videos responding to people who I otherwise agree with on a lot of points, explaining in detail specifically why I think they're wrong on the areas where we disagree. For me, that's the standard. So when I read a comment from someone saying that I'm usually very intelligent and logical, but on the one issue where I disagree with them, I apparently just completely abandon all reason at all, I just don't believe it. And if you want to evidence that point, find an example of me arguing for a position where I disagree with you, where I look as unconvincing in my argumentation as Big Joel does. If you can find video evidence of me arguing for a position where my argumentation is no more sophisticated than, well, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? I mean, people aren't trying to brainwash you. Then if you can find that evidence, you have my permission to say, ugh, King Critical, on this issue, you are just obviously really dumb and have no idea what you're talking about. So that provides some context, but let me fill in the blanks. The first thing I need to do is lay my cards on the table. When people say, you should just stick to the trans issue because you're terrible at arguing around this topic, it does annoy me. I mean, obviously I'm not an idiot. I know that the best strategy for being online is to not obsess over comments like that, but even while not obsessing over it, I can still recognize that it is annoying. Mostly because it's kind of the exact opposite to my self-perception. I think that I'm a generally logical person who's quite good at formulating arguments and pretty good at assessing the quality of other people's arguments. And what I'd say I lack is specialist knowledge. I'm usually not in my videos consulting studies or referencing particular theorists. I recently started posting content on a different channel related to religion, and I put off that for a year because I didn't feel like I was sufficiently knowledgeable about the topic. And now I've started posting there and I still feel incredibly uncomfortable with the possibility that an issue might come up which I know literally nothing about. I would also say, by the way, that this ability to recognize that as a limitation of mine is in itself a strength. Like, one aspect of me saying that I think I'm pretty good at arguing is that I often disguise my lack of knowledge and make myself seem more informed than I am. But you can see how if I get a comment from someone saying, you're really good at arguing about this trans issue, but you should stick to that because your arguments about other topics are just terrible, I don't really know what to say because that's literally the exact opposite to how I feel about my content. And just to stress, these aren't people saying that I lack specialist knowledge on a particular topic. If someone said that I misunderstood a certain economic theory or I was really misinformed on an important geopolitical event, they might be right. But instead, it's people saying that my logically grounded arguments on other topics aren't valid, but on the areas where I happen to agree with them, suddenly I'm perfectly logical. I recently said in one of my bonus reaction videos that I do for Patreon, where I was responding to Philosophy Tube, that it's very important to be able to recognize the distinction between two different groups. Those with whom you disagree on a lot of stuff, but can at least recognize that they have a talent for formulating and presenting arguments, and those who you disagree with, and they're genuinely just not intelligent or particularly academically capable. For me, I have the advantage of having changed my mind on a lot of important issues, so I'm able to say, well, even when I agreed with that person, I was able to recognize that their arguments weren't very good. By the way, having just mentioned my bonus Patreon videos, you should check them out, and I'll just thank my current contributors and say you're all very appreciated. The point is, if you're able to say, I disagree with this person, but they're really good at arguing for their position, then I respect that. And in my view, the fact that I'm able to say of the content creators I watch a lot, regardless of how much I agree with them, that they're good at making arguments, that's one of my strengths. So again, if that's something that I value in people, the ability to recognize intelligence beyond just whether someone already agrees with you, the apparent absence of that quality is is obviously going to annoy me when I upload a video about a non-trans topic, which I know some of my audience are going to disagree with, but then a very high proportion of the comments are literally just, wow, you're usually so smart and logical when you talk about the trans topic. I just can't believe that on this area where I disagree with you, you have this selective blind spot where all of that intelligence and logic goes completely out the window. I mean, clearly if you're writing that, then one of us must have a blind spot where we're unable to follow the logic on a certain issue. It just seems a bit unwarranted for you to expect me to take it to granted that the one with that blind spot is me instead of you. So anyway, my totally healthy, definitely not obsession over this issue, I constantly find myself coming back to this one video by the YouTuber Big Joel. Now, I think that Big Joel is a good YouTuber. I've watched almost all of his videos multiple times, and that's because I find him to be both funny and insightful. But Big Joel is pro-trans. He thinks that being trans is correct, and that means when I watch one of his videos about that topic, it puts me in the same position that some of my subscribers might be in when I say something about a topic that they disagree with me on. So this is the context of why I referenced a particular Big Joel video where he touches on that issue. In fact, as far as I know, it's the only video where he's discussed the trans issue. And I've actually discussed this entire video before, and I will link that up here, but it's a very old video, so I wouldn't recommend watching it, and this video is kind of intended to replace and supersede that one. It's this video of Big Joel responding to Dave Rubin talking about 1984 and how that's kind of the same as the woke left. Also, this video features Michael Knowles back when he was much less famous, and as such he basically just gets acknowledged as some random dude.
Dave Rubin and a guy named Mike Knowles.
And basically the overall point I'm trying to make in this video is that even if you agree with Big Joel when he's talking about politics more broadly, you still shouldn't agree with him on the trans issue because his pro-trans arguments are obviously much worse than all his other ones. And to demonstrate this, I took two arguments from right at the start of this video. The first is him defending the broad progressive stance on racial justice, and the second is, of course, him defending trans identity. And my argument is that he does a very convincing job defending the former and a comparatively awful job defending the latter. So if you are a progressive, then you shouldn't be pro-trans because we can literally use other progressive arguments as a frame of reference to show just how bad pro-trans arguments are by comparison. So let me just briefly make this point so you can see what I'm saying. Big Joel says the following.
You know, they want to find a connection between doublethink in the world of 1984 and today's society, and so they decide that anti-racism is like doublethink.
People who say they're anti-racist are the ones who are acting in a racist way, and the way George Orwell describes it is he calls it doublethink.
Mm-hmm.
We have to get rid of America's terrible past, which had segregation, and the way we're going to do that is institute segregation.
It's contradictory to think both that racism exists and that our solutions to it might have to fall along racial lines. It's impossible to hold those two thoughts in your head at once. It's beyond reason.
So there are 2 points I want to make here. Firstly, I think that Big Joel's underlying argument is a good one, and secondly, that I think he presents it in a very compelling way. See, it's pretty clear here that Dave and Michael are saying that if you're going to be anti-racist, then you should treat all races the same. Basically, you should act as if race doesn't exist. But if you genuinely think there's been a history of racial oppression, then of course you might want to redress that, and that means paying attention to race. More generally, this talk of doublethink is a very easy way to dismiss genuinely worthwhile nuance. Whether you think it's a good thing or not, black people supporting black-owned businesses is very different from white people making their businesses white only. For the simple reason that historically white people have held much more of the economic power in the Anglosphere. Now would be a good time to make the disclaimer that I don't necessarily unequivocally agree with the progressive left on every point of racial justice politics myself. I think there are many nuances where I prefer to take things on a case-by-case basis, and I definitely think that there have been many efforts to achieve racial justice that have in fact been counterproductive. But for Joel's underlying point to be good, it doesn't have to be showing that Black Lives Matter or some other racial justice activism group is right about everything. He just has to show that you want to fix the issue of racial segregation by doing segregation, and that's doublethink, is not actually a good argument. And it's worth noting that again, even if you think that idea is stupid, it's not doublethink. Doublethink is all about accepting self-contradictory slogans without even thinking about the fact they contradict. But redressing racial injustice through what could be called segregationist policies does show an appreciation for nuance and how social context can affect things and make even very similar things still different when they're employed in different ways. Like, just by way of analogy, the fact that we might sometimes achieve peace through war is not necessarily doublethink in itself, right? Because what if the whole world is ready for peace and there's just this one warmonger warmonger who keeps invading people. Would it not be fair to say that if everyone declared war on that guy and took him out, then they have literally, through war, achieved peace? So sometimes things might sound self-contradictory, but they're actually not, and just saying that's doublethink is the true thought-terminating cliche. Now, the other thing I want to point out is not only would I agree with Big Joel's reasoning, but I also think he presents this argument in a really great way.
It's contradictory to think both that racism exists and that our solutions to it might have to fall along racial lines.
This is such a concise and confident and clear way of pointing out the issue with Knowles' objection. Whether you agree with this argument or not, I hope you'd agree that this is a very confident and concise and well-made expression of this point. In the same way that someone could defend a position you agree with in a way that's rambly, unconfident, and unconvincing, the opposite can be true as well. Also, it's really funny that Big Joel literally says this in the video.
I might disagree with Dave Rubin about a great many things, but that is a bulletproof argument.
He says this as a joke, but I hope he would be willing to admit that it is possible for people to make a good argument for a position with which he might disagree. I think that trans identity is nonsense, but I know for a fact that I have on this channel before said, even though I disagree with this trans activist, they are making the best possible argument for this position that they could. And I'm able to recognize that there are some trans activists who make really bad arguments for trans identity, and there are other trans activists who make pretty good arguments for trans identity. Not convincing, but the best arguments they could be making. But yeah, speaking of me thinking trans identity is nonsense, let's get on to the next thing, which is Joel's argument as it relates to trans identity.
Or like trans people existing and wanting to be respected. That's a bit like Winston being brainwashed into thinking that 2 + 2 = 5.
This ties into the insistence of the government. You have to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, because if we all really believe that, then that will be true. And it seems to be the same thing when you call a he, when you call him, her, you have really substantively changed who he is.
Yeah. And you know, that's a bit dumb, isn't it? Like, I don't want to overplay my hand here or whatever, but personally, I don't think that trans people are trying to brainwash us.
So the big question here is, do I think that this argument is worse simply because I disagree with it, or is it actually a worse argument? Well, let's just start with the obvious. Look at how this argument is made.
And you know, that's a bit dumb, isn't it? Like, I don't want to overplay my hand here or whatever, but
it's not confident, it's not convincing, it's kind of rambly and wavering. This is what I meant in the first clip I played where I said, if you can find video evidence of me arguing for a position where my argumentation is no more sophisticated than, well, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? I mean, people aren't trying to brainwash you. Before you even get into the substance of the argument, it's so obvious it's a worse argument just from his tone. He's almost pleading with the audience. That's kind of dumb, isn't it? Right? Like, I don't actually have to defend why it's dumb, do I? You guys agree with me, don't you? To me, the difference is so stark between the confidence with which he defends one position and the other. And when you look at the actual argument, well, I mean, first of all, Knowles' argument is pretty simple. Just like an Orwellian government would say that declaring 2 + 2 = 5 makes that true, even though we have very good reasons to think it's not, the apparent attitude of trans activists is that saying a male is a woman makes that true, even though we have very good reasons to think it's not. So Joel could engage with this in a few ways. The most obvious thing he could do is show how actually we do have a good reason to think that a biological male can be a woman. Or maybe he could argue that trans activists aren't literally claiming that calling men women causes them to be women. But instead, he just says, well, trans people aren't trying to brainwash us. Okay. Michael Knowles didn't claim they were. He said that they're trying to make people affirm a statement which isn't true, as if affirming that statement will make it true. Where's the lie there? Even if you think that Joel's argument around racial justice wasn't very convincing, at least there's a discussion to be had there. We can talk about specific policies and whether it makes sense to understand them as anti-racist if they are treating people differently based on race. We actually could address in abstract the entire idea of whether it makes sense to redress racial injustice along racial lines. I mean, heck, we could have a very big conversation about to what extent there was racial injustice in the past, to what extent it persists today, and to what extent we should actively try to redress it. But when someone says trans activism is demanding we affirm a falsehood as if by affirming it we cause it to be true, and Joel's response is just, well, that's kind of dumb, they're not trying to brainwash us, there's no discussion to be had there, no place to go from there. The best thing we could do is bring it back to the original statement and point out that Joel's response doesn't actually address the central point. And that's always a good litmus test for a response. Whether it's good or bad, does showing that it's bad at least involve moving on to something else, advancing on the discussion, or is it just bringing it back to the original point? If it's the latter, then that's the worst kind of bad argument, because that means the argument didn't even address what was being said. I would be very happy if everyone, whether they were pro-progressive racial politics and pro-trans, or pro-progressive racial politics and anti-trans, or anti-progressive racial politics and anti-trans, or the, I imagine, quite rare combination of anti-progressive racial politics and pro-trans, would be able to agree that if we're just assessing the quality of Big Joel's arguments here, the pro-progressive racial politics argument is clearly much better than the pro-trans argument. And again, the big point here is that I try to assess my own content through this lens as someone who occasionally makes videos which I know will go against what a lot of my audience might be inclined to otherwise believe. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I like having a diverse audience with all sorts of different opinions. But if you're going to comment like, wow dude, I agree with you on the trans issue, but every time you talk about some other issue, you show that you're super dumb and really you're not a very logical person. Well, if you want me to take that seriously, you're going to have to provide some concrete evidence. When I say that while I agree with Big Joel on a lot of issues, I think on the trans issue specifically, he's incredibly dumb and illogical, I'm able to evidence that really effectively by pointing at how terrible his argument was pretty much the only time he's spoken about this topic. And what I'm saying is if you want me to take you seriously on the issues where you say, well, I disagree with you and that must mean I'm really stupid, you would have to provide some evidence of me making a similarly terrible argument. An argument where all that I'm saying can be likened to, well, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? And then just making a total straw man of the position I'm arguing against. By the way, at least some of the videos I've made relating to issues other than trans identity, I've genuinely been hoping that someone would make a response to them. My video on race and ethnic diversity, I would love to see someone who disagrees with me make a response to that where they debunk my core points. Same for my video tearing apart the logic for the Electoral College. And also on my capitalism versus socialism video, although that one's a bit weird because most of the negative comments there are from people who are pro-capitalist, but I would actually be much more interested in a response from a socialist because the actual point of that video was defending capitalism. So I would like to see a socialist respond to the defense of capitalism I make in that video. But what I'd really like is a response more impressive than just, I disagree and Casey misrepresents a few things and misses a few key points. If you really want to justify your claim that I'm just a total moron whenever I talk about an issue with which I disagree with you on, you have to provide an example of me arguing as terribly as Big Joel does. And this is what leads me to the comment I started this video off with. The only direct response I'm aware of to me having made this challenge to those who disagree with me on some other issues. Hey man, I'm about 5 minutes and 30 seconds into your video and I already have that proof you asked for. You pulled a random clip from a Joel video that isn't an argument and used that to say that it was his only argument and therefore he didn't make one. I checked that Joel video and he goes on to discuss why he believes that later on, which is his typical style. I don't think it is necessary to check a video on something I agree with you on because seemingly the only thing you do is make videos on trans people. I know you won't change your mind from a comment though, so who cares? Now, the weird thing about this comment is you might notice I'm giving a very broad canvas here. I'm saying that you would simply need to find an example of me arguing about anything where my arguments aren't very credible. However, this guy is specifically saying, hey, even your argument responding to Big Joel on this issue isn't very good. Which sort of misses the point of what I'm saying because I was saying, can someone find me an example of me talking about a specific issue other than trans identity where my arguments are terrible? But this is obviously about trans identity, so I guess at best it would be showing that I'm selectively illogical when it specifically comes to Big Joel. The challenge is sort of taking it for granted that I am logical when I criticize trans identity, because again, I'm talking about people who say, I really love your content on trans identity, but on other issues, you're totally illogical. But regardless of that, I thought, okay, well maybe this comment will still be interesting because like I say, it's the only response I've got so far to this challenge that I have issued to my entire audience, at least those members of my audience who have disagreed with me on some major issues before. Now I would say even if Big Joel does elaborate on this point later on, it's still a very bad presentation of the argument to start off making it in this incredibly unconvincing way. So as such, my response of pointing that out would still be accurate, because even if he makes a better argument later on, it would still be true he made a poor argument initially. But here's the thing, right? This person is wrong. Like, they're just lying. See, when I read that comment, I thought, well, goodness me, maybe that person's right actually. Maybe I did just watch a portion of that video, come to that bad argument, decide to make my response response and never actually finished it. So I figured, hey, I guess I should actually respond to that video. And my plan was to make this video where I would respond to the elaboration that Joel makes on his point. But he basically doesn't elaborate on the trans issue at all. I'm going to do something uncharacteristic here and actually link to Big Joel's video in the description so you can confirm. You can just load up the transcript and just Control F trans. I've obviously watched the whole thing, and you will see that he just doesn't really elaborate on his point about trans identity at all after the clip that I've already shown. If you search for the word trans in the transcript, you'll see that the only other time he mentions the concept of trans identity is here.
So we have the ideology of our Big Brother society down, right? Racism is bad, and trans people should be afforded basic respect and decency. That's Big Brother.
You might notice that this is not an elaboration on his original point, it's a summary, if anything. Just take a moment to appreciate how bizarre it is that the commenter who inspired this entire video was just blatantly lying. Their comment was claiming that I was wrong to dismiss Big Joel's argument in the way I did because he elaborated on it, and, I quote, I checked that Joel video, and he goes on to discuss why he believes that later on. The clip I just showed, which is the only elaboration we see on the trans issue, is not a discussion, and it's not explaining why he believes what he believes. Like, what a crazy thing to lie about, saying, I checked the video, and then you just say something which anyone who actually checks can immediately see isn't true. The best job I could do to actually turn this into some sort of elaboration is that Joel is saying that Michael Knowles believes these people should be denied basic respect and decency, and of course we would say that usually people should receive basic respect and decency, so therefore Michael Knowles must be wrong. But the problem here is that basic respect and decency doesn't entail believing everything somebody claims about themselves. The analogy I always make here is that I, as an evangelical Christian, could claim that I am saved through faith by the grace of God. The problem is, if you don't believe in God, or that the wages of sin are death, such that there's anything for me to be saved from, then you're not going to believe me when I claim that I am saved. But that's not you disrespecting me by rejecting my identity in that regard. If anything, you're respecting me more by being honest with me. I'd be more offended if you were like, okay, Mr. Saved Christian, sure thing, you're definitely saved, but deep down I think you're totally deluded. The only sense in which you can argue that accepting trans identity constitutes basic respect is if trans identity is obviously true. But Big Joel, for all he's made videos about lots of other topics, has never made a video defending trans identity as obviously correct or even plausible and coherent. So absent that, he literally is just saying that it would be disrespectful to not affirm trans identity like it would be disrespectful to not affirm someone's claim that 2 + 2 = 5. But yeah, the main takeaway here is that the rest of the video offers no elaboration on this point.
Oh, that's the end of the video! Ooh! That's the end of the video.
Like, was the original commenter just trolling me when they were like, I checked the video, and he elaborates on his point and makes it much clearer what he actually meant? And he obviously just doesn't do that. That's not anywhere in the rest of the video. There's one interesting point made right towards the end of the video that many people would have missed if they're the kinds of people who click off of videos immediately, but I assume you guys don't do that because you like to watch the 1-minute Patreon teasers I always put at the end of my videos.
Donate to me on Patreon if you want to. There's an extended cut of this video on there that I decided was really bad. Like, the intro is like 8 minutes long and it's really boring.
By the way, my bonus Patreon videos aren't bad. They're great. I mean, they do have some rambling in them, but my rambling is goated. So there is an extended video and that might have more stuff, but he says this is bad. He identifies it as the intro and says it's boring. So unless he's the worst person in the world at structuring and editing a video, I can't imagine that he had a concrete explanation of exactly why trans identity is valid, which he then decided to cut because he just thought it was boring. And by the way, that can't be what the person was claiming in the comment, because they said that he elaborates on this later on, whereas Joel says that this was in the introduction. No, I'm not going to spend money to access 8 minutes of bad video, especially when the value proposition from my own Patreon is that you can spend money to get 45 minutes of great quality videos every single week. But okay, here's the crazy thing, right? Despite the fact that this comment was just blatantly lying with what they were claiming, and they totally failed to actually respond to the challenge that I was issuing in the timestamped portion of the video, they did kind of make me reconsider and to some extent go back on my original claim. Because my original original claim was basically, Big Joel is generally really good at arguing, but on the trans identity issue, he's really terrible at arguing, and he seems to know that he's bad at arguing, which is why he doesn't sound very confident, and that suggests that trans identity probably isn't true, even if all the other progressive positions are. But when I watched the rest of the video, I found out actually a lot of Joel's arguments are pretty bad, and like I say, none of the rest of the video really was about trans identity. Meaning that at least in this video, Joel's arguments are bad even when he's not talking about trans identity. So what I'm going to do with the rest of our time here today is just assess those later arguments he makes. We start off not too bad with a third example given of Mike and Dave likening the contemporary progressive left to 1984.
Or, and this is one of my favorites, they claim that an NPR article that's advocating that we decolonize our bookshelves is essentially advocating for book burning.
The Nazis were literally burning books. What are we doing right now? Yeah. We're not burning books yet, although NPR did put out that thing about how you have to decolonize your bookshelf, which in essence is a modern book burning.
The books,
They're not going to write, oh, burn all your books, but they will say, get rid of bad books.
Yeah.
1984.
So Joel's response to this is to frame decolonizing your bookshelves as including more racially diverse authors.
When they were saying that you should read more diverse authors was essentially advocating for book burning.
But the problem is the term decolonize implies getting rid of something. The prefix de often means to remove. You delete, destroy, desist. Now, I think we can talk about decolonizing our bookshelves as not getting rid of problematic books, but instead just introducing more diversity with the books we're reading. And obviously that wouldn't be like book burning because that's a greater variety of books. But given the typical meaning of the prefix de, it's not that surprising that people hear decolonize your bookshelves and they understand that as meaning you have to remove bad books. There are books that are problematic, that are colonialist, and you need to get rid of them. But here's the thing, right? Everything I've addressed so far is just from the beginning of the video, the first 6 minutes of an 18-minute video. Joel's main point for the rest of the video is very simple. We live in a conservative world, so conservatives shouldn't complain about the world that they live in.
PragerU doesn't actually think that a conservative world is a good one. They know that their policies have not made society a better place, and more importantly, they are speaking to an audience of mostly working-class Americans who know that fact very, very well. I mean, they're living in it, right? They're living in the shit society. You can't really tell them it's good because they know that it's not.
He says that this is the main point of his video, if you'll excuse me presenting a really long clip.
And you can really see this understanding come through in one moment toward the end of the video. The main reason I decided to make this.
It seems like no matter who wins the election, no matter which party wins, certain things just keep on happening. We lose more and more of our freedoms, we rack up more and more of our debt, the culture keeps going more and more in one direction. It doesn't seem to matter who wins.
Holy shit, right? That's amazing. Because for one moment, these guys are actually interpreting 1984. They are using it as an opportunity to talk about power, the way it is distributed, and how it works. But of course, this can't last.
So this makes Big Joel look so dumb, like iconically dumb. So much so that, considering the age of this video, it has me hoping that he's maybe matured a bit since then. Because I'm sure if you're a conservative, you don't need me to tell you this, but the idea that all of the policies that the US and the UK's government have been enacting have been ideal for conservatives and the exact policies the conservatives would want to see is nonsense. I have a video where I argue that trans ideology has been imposed on society without any democratic mandate. People didn't vote for any of this. And I got a comment from someone saying, well, isn't that the same thing that's happened with mass immigration? And yes, absolutely, I've always agreed that's the case. Mass immigration to the UK has grown massively over the past 20 years, even as the British public have become more opposed to mass immigration. In 2023, we had almost 1 million net migration. I also remember this meme I saw one time, which was this guy with a microscope, and it said, me looking for anything that conservatives have actually conserved. If you're a conservative, I would not blame you for having got more and more mad for the 14 years that the Conservatives were in charge of the UK from 2010 to 2024. And that's at least not directly because Conservative policies are so bad. It's not as if if the UK got super conservative over the last 14 years and that was proven to be a disaster. No, from 2010 to 2024, society got more liberal, more progressive. Gay marriage was legalized. We had net migration of 4.25 million people. And since some people would have been leaving, that means even more than that were coming in. Almost all the trans identity stuff happened in that time. In 2010, no one was really talking about it. And by 2024, you had loads of kids claiming that they were trans or genderqueer. And what's often called critical race theory took off in the UK during that time. We had the Black Lives Matter protests, problematic statues being torn down. If you are a conservative, then I may disagree with you to greater or lesser extents on lots of different issues. But I hope you appreciate that I'm at least smart enough to recognize that the past decade or two has not been some grand march of victory for conservative principles. Joel wants to claim that conservatives have had times where they've held government power and therefore we're living in a conservative world. And in the UK that first part is at least true. Until last year we had a period of continuous conservative rule. But if he is right, then that just proves that government power isn't that important, because in that same period society in a lot of ways got a lot less conservative. The irony is that Big Joel makes fun of Dave Rubin for not being able to look at institutional power.
And so, because Dave Rubin can't look at institutional power, because the problems he's pointing to cannot come from the establishment, he's left in this video with the thinnest argument imaginable, that the basic coercive mechanism through which our dystopia functions is cancel culture. Because the problems he's pointing to cannot come from the establishment.
But it's so obvious it's Big Joel who's ignorant about the ways that power can manifest beyond state control. Like, the media and academic institutions have been the driving force of so-called wokeness in society, and that is what has often frustrated the efforts of conservatives. Those are institutions, Joel. That's what institutional power is, and conservatives aren't unable to talk about that. They talk about it all the time. It's almost like he doesn't understand the very important difference between political parties and ideologies.
It is, after all, the duty of the party to provide us two contradictory messages and ask us to not only accept them, but believe them. We must believe that the world is degenerate, decayed, broken down, the worst it's ever been, and we must believe that they're doing a great job running it. 10 out of 10 ruling class, perfecto. And if those two statements contradict each other in your mind, well, you just have to believe harder.
This is his closing statement to the video, and as you can tell, it's supposed to be really profound, but it's just obviously very stupid. This idea that all conservatives believe that they're doing a great job running it is nonsense. I complained to no end in the 2024 election that the main strategy from the conservatives was to talk about how the country needed to be fixed, and it needed to be turned around, when they were the ones who'd been in charge of it for the past 14 years. It is insane that so many parties have the electoral strategy of talking about there being a crisis that they need to fix, even when they're the ones who have been in charge. But again, these are political parties, not ideologies, and the idea that the entire ruling class are conservative, as Big Joel suggests, is ridiculous. The Conservatives in 2024 were unironically running on a platform of stopping mass immigration after having just let in 4.26 million migrants. And I guess I should relate this to America, where Big Joel and Dave Rubin and Michael Knowles are all from. In some sense, I think America is less relevant to this argument because we've had 14 years of conservative rule from 2010 to 2024, while in America, during the same period, they had 4. But yeah, obviously Donald Trump was in charge for 4 years, during which a lot of issues remained unfixed.
Like, are we in a particularly Orwellian time?
George Orwell is describing here the reason it resonates with, not just now, perhaps at a particularly Orwellian moment.
If so, Donald Trump clearly hasn't fixed our dystopia. When they made this video, he had already been president for almost 4 years, and everything's still broken.
Now honestly, if I was a conservative, I would on principle not support a multiple divorcee, gambling profiteer, glutton who spent most of his time playing golf so that he could funnel money from the budget for the Secret Service to stay at his own hotels and thus make himself rich off the back of the taxpayer. If I was a conservative, I would just say, well, Trump obviously isn't a conservative, he's a degenerate, and that's completely against conservative principles, so of course he's going to screw things up. That doesn't suggest that conservative principles are bad, because what conservative principles does Trump have? The issue is that Dave Rubin does appeal to Trump as an example of someone who would fix an Orwellian society.
But in many ways, when I was rereading it, I kept thinking, man, what they needed was a Trump.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because what was Trump, or what is Trump? He just sort of broke through all of this. If you're talking about how do you break the duopoly, how do you break the false choices, how do you break political correctness, all of these things, who has been the greatest breaker of those things?
What a fitting and tragic end to this idea, right? That in the one moment where it looks like they're saying something of value, something attentive to the text, something that's kind of transgressive, it is revealed to be meaningless and vapid to them. Just like what happens in 1984, we can oppose power and we can criticize power, but only when we can do those things as a prop. Wait, shouts Dave Rubin nervously. All those things we said before are totally problems, but Donald Trump is fixing it. He's got it under control. Now, this moment taken together doesn't make any sense. Of course it doesn't.
Now, all I'll say here is that the specific context is that Dave is talking about how both parties are the same. And Trump certainly was a controversial figure who shook up the consensus between the two parties and made them a lot more different now than they were in the past. So, in some sense, Dave Rubin is just literally right here. So really, this isn't as good a criticism from Big Joel as you might think. But yeah, isn't that fun? Turns out Big Joel might be wrong about more than I initially thought. Funny thing is, of course, in case you couldn't tell, one of my main points here was that I think that people who disagree with me on other issues and argue that I'm illogical on those issues are incorrect. But the funny thing is that I've now debunked Big Joel attempting to debunk conservatives, and I think I've done a pretty good job at it. In fact, I'd actually wonder, has there been a conservative commentator who's done as good a job debunking Big Joel as I just did there? I'm not sure. So it would be nice if based on that, my conservative audience who disagrees with me on some points would say, actually, this does show that Michael cares about the importance of arguments more than ideology, so he's not being illogical on the points where I disagree with him. He clearly puts logic first in all cases. But maybe what will instead happen is next time I put out a video that conservatives don't like, they'll say, wow, even though you're really good at debunking Big Joel and you use logic there, now suddenly you've become completely illogical. So I'll just reiterate one final time, if you disagree with me, that's fine, but if you claim that I'm illogical every single time I disagree with you, I don't think you understand how logic works. And I guess the reason I find this video from Big Joel very interesting, and having watched more of it, I now think it's more interesting for this purpose, is that for me, it's a really good example and a good litmus test, I guess, for how good are you at identifying the relative quality of different arguments. And again, whether you agree with someone or not, looking at whether or not their arguments for that position are good. I mean, for the record, I agree with Big Joel that conservative policies on balance aren't good for creating a maximally flourishing world. Like, that's the underlying principle of his argument there, that these conservatives are complaining about the world while they themselves are conservatives. And he's saying, well, I actually don't think your policies would make the world better. I would not call myself conservative. While I agree, and I maybe call myself a traditionalist, I do think there are some conservative policies that are good. I wouldn't use that term to describe myself. But even though I agree with his underlying position, I still recognize that the argument for that position was not very well made, and that is just an important thing for everyone to be able to do. Anyway, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. It wasn't what I was expecting it to be, and that, like I say, I went into this thinking, what? Did I misrepresent Big Joel? Did I just completely fail to recognize the fact that he had elaborated on his support for trans identity, and I'd completely ignored that? And therefore I was expecting to be organizing my notes so I could respond to all of the different points that Joel made about trans identity in that video, but instead I just discovered to my bewilderment that the person who made that comment was literally lying, which I don't know why they did that, but it was fun to return back to this challenge. And genuinely, yeah, if you are someone who actually thinks that I have been illogical on an area where I've disagreed with you, and illogical in an obvious way, where it's not just you think I'm illogical because you disagree with me, but you can clearly show, no, this, when you really think about it, doesn't make any sense, he's just not addressing the points or whatever. I welcome you pointing to examples of that. And you know what, look, at the end of the day, if you want to jumpstart your own YouTube career, feel free to just make however many responses to me on the issues you disagree with me on. And yeah, I might even give you a shout out. Why not? You know, I believe in you. You can do it. Anyway, speaking of doing it, you can give on Patreon. You can do all the algorithm stuff. Here is a clip of my Patreon.
I think people have the right to make risky decisions about their healthcare too.
Okay. But you notice you're avoiding saying the big one, right? Children. You think children. Even then, you're saying, oh, if you have values, you should be honest about it. But you're not being honest, are you? Because now you're saying people, even though this was always a debate, and we're talking about puberty blockers, right? This was always a debate about children. Should children have a right, and again, notice, to do what they like with their bodies without politicians interfering. All right, that's specifically what you're actually saying is, I think that children have the cognitive faculties to decide to completely go against their natural biological development. That is not what you're saying, so you're not being honest about your values. So if that looks interesting, then you can check that out and you will enjoy it. And I will see you all next week. Bye!